Welcome to the Cyber City Circuits Presents Datasheet Digest. My name is David and I am your host today. Today's episode will cover the datasheet for the Texas Instruments CD4017B decade counter. This datasheet is freely available from the Texas Instrument website if you want to follow along. First, we'll start with a summary of the history of the part and of the datasheet. Then we'll critique the datasheet with our proprietary 555-point analysis system. And finally, we will summarize some key takeaways from the datasheet. If you would like to support the show, you can leave us a written review on Spotify. Thank you. The CD4017 is a member of the 4000 series of CMOS logic. CMOS was released by RCA in 1968, and the CD4017 would have been released very early in the CMOS life cycle. The earliest reference I can find to the CD4017 is on page 15 of the December 1972 copy of RCA Engineer magazine. It was in a list of CMOS logic ICs that RCA was trying to sell. If you get a copy of the datasheet from the show notes, you'll see on the top of the datasheet it says that it was acquired from Harris Semiconductor. I found earlier data books from National Semiconductor and Harris Semiconductor that had very similar data sheets than this. It would have been an earlier iteration of it, but it had all the same diagrams and everything. This data sheet is dated revised February 2004. There is no revision history. So I have no way to tell how old it is or anything, but there's a reason for that. The reason is because this is out of section 3, page 51 of a Texas Instrument data book. Data books are antiquated. Nobody uses data books in 2023, but yet here we are with a scan, a poor quality scan of a data book page that Texas Instruments saw fit to put on their website as a primary reference. I understand why. This is all research that's been done, it's been solved, and it was solved 50 years ago. I get it. But can we get a new data sheet? The first 6 pages are just scans out of a data book, and they're good, very well organized. They're standard fare for a data sheet from the 70s and 80s. It's pretty descriptive. The scan isn't that great. The scan, it could have been a little bit better, especially with some of the diagrams, but if you squint hard enough, it works, it's fine. The functional diagrams and the terminal diagrams are great, but it doesn't really make much of a substitute for a modern day pin table, function table. It doesn't really have a pin table, function table per se, but in its initial summary, it lists all the different pins, your clock pin, reset, clock inhibit, and your carryout pin. And it explains in that little summary how they work, but then it gives all the features and applications. So the 4017 counter is essentially a Johnson ring counter. And Johnson ring counters are pretty cool. Johnson counter basically knows how to count to 1. It knows 0 and it knows 1 and nothing else. But it knows when one output is 1, the other output is 0 and vice versa. And it has a carryout connection and a reset connection. The 4022 has 4 Johnson counters, so it can have up to 8 outputs. It's called an octal counter. This is a decade counter, so it has 10 outputs with 5 Johnson counters. So it starts at 0 and it goes to 1, but when it resets back to 0, it pulses the next set of transistor logic. And so then that goes to a 1, and when it resets to a 0, it pulses the next Johnson counter, and then the Johnson counter after that, and so on and so on. It's used a lot for dividing pulses. So let's say I have 1,000 pulses a second, but I can only read 100 pulses a second. I can divide all my pulses by 10 by feeding it into the clock signal and then time my output to 0. So that every a 555 timer with a 4017 decade counter. And so it gives you a strobe. And it's really cool. And you can tie a bunch of LEDs to it. You can make it do a night rider. One of the things we did with one was we did a dice kit. It was a D6, but when you touched the button, it charged a capacitor, which charged a 555 timer, which sent pulses to the 4017, which just cycled through all 6 choices. And then when it stopped, when the capacitor was discharged and the 555 timer stopped sending pulses, then the 4017 stopped And whatever number it stopped on was a result of the capacitor fully discharging. And in the data sheet, you can see really well how they work. It has a lot of diagrams to show how they function, and all that's in the show notes. One of the really great things about CMOS logic is that it has a very wide voltage range. So the recommended voltage range for the 4017 is 3 volts to 18 volts. You can hook this sucker up to an alternator and it will run just fine. And it's going to pass on the outputs, it'll pass that input voltage minus like 0.5 volts. In the electrical characteristics section of the datasheet, it actually describes how the voltage works across 3 different specific voltages. So 5 volts, 10 volts, and 15 volts. At 5 volts, a low is below 1.5 volts and a high is above 3.5 volts. While at 15 volts, which is an alternator, is actually higher than alternator, isn't it? A low is below 4 volts and the high is above 11 volts. So that's just a huge buffer that can give you a lot of confidence when you put it in a really noisy environment. As I was looking at these, I noticed that the input voltage on the low side is everything up to 30% of the input voltage, and everything on the high side, generally, is everything above 70% of the input voltage. So that's just really neat. So you have a big buffer there between 30% and 70%. Again, at the dynamic electrical characteristics chart, it does a similar thing, but with the clock frequency. So this thing can operate at 11 megahertz if you're pushing 15 volts through it, which is by modern standards kind of slow. In 2023, it's kind of slow. But in 1970, whew, lightning fast, 11 megahertz. But ultimately, it was being used as a divider in a lot of cases, meaning that every time it got a clock, you would hook a lead up to it where you wanted it to be divided. On page 5 of the data sheet, you see where it's chaining CD4017Bs together using AND gates, and the carryout pin is pretty neat. Through the AND gate, you're tying the clock to the carryout pin of the last Johnson counter of the previous 4017. And so what that will do is it'll make your Johnson ring counter system bigger. It'll give you more bits. So if you wanted something like 16-bit, you could take two 4022s and put them in line with each other. And on page 6 of the data sheet, it'll actually show you a drawing of the die that was used for the 4017. It's not a great scan of it, but it's there. Now on page 7, we really see where Texas Instruments is starting to try to modernize some of these old data sheets from these data books. So while the main data sheet is last revised 2004, and the data sheet itself could be dating back to the late 70s, there's an addendum for modern day ordering information. This is dated October 2022, so it's probably still very relevant. It tells you what status is for each part, gives you pin numbers, package quantities, etc. The CD4017B comes in PDIP in a tube of 25. You can also get it in a SOIC package, which is SOIC 16, in tubes of 40, or on a reel of 2,500 units. And all that's covered in the packaging information of the data sheet. But if you go through page 7, 8, 9, which is this addendum, this package option addendum, there's a lot of white space and there's a lot of just stuff that is just out of place. On page 10, there's a copy of some boilerplate Texas Instruments documentation. So your footprints, your dimensional drawings, and all that stuff, it's all been standardized and made into boilerplate documentation in order to modernize these older data sheets. I know we're all familiar with the PDIP version of the CD4017. The one I designed with in the past is the SOIC 16 package. On page 20, you can see the PDIP dimensional drawings and so on. And page 24, there's just some standardized disclaimers. I have done a detailed analysis of the CD4017B datasheet as it's made available currently on the TI.com website. I graded across 10 different metrics. The first section is presentation and accessibility. This covers things like language, how easy it is to get. Can I Google search it? Do I need an account to download the data sheet? Do I need to have a translator to read it? And out of 75 points, this data sheet received 59. I will say that I looked up CD4017B datasheet on Google, and the first non-sponsored link was the TI datasheet. Ahead of that was a link that showed me the technical library information associated with this datasheet. So it showed me different books that TI has written over the years on logic and different examples of logic, and then it showed a lot of schematics of different examples of how this chip has been used in different ways for automotive, for medical, all kinds of really cool things for reference diagrams. But to be clear, the datasheet that we were provided has really very little in reference diagrams, but that's beside the point. So out of that effort, this datasheet receives 59 out of 75 points. Section number 2 is organization and layout. This includes things like table of contents, the structure. Does it have headings? Does it have subsection headings? And one thing it does have is it has an addendum that has buttons on it where it'll go to the ordering page for different part numbers, which that's nice. And that's laid out really clean. Doesn't have a table of contents, doesn't have navigation. The data sheet in general is good. It has graphics, it has structure, it has charts, it has all kinds of diagrams that really explain how things work. And because of that, it gets 42 out of 60 points. The third one is electrical characteristics. And this data sheet in general, it's pretty good. But it doesn't include things like good thermal characteristics. It has some with the max ratings, but and it's CMOS logic. It doesn't have thermal characteristics, but that's fine. It's not included, so it doesn't get those points. The same thing with noise characteristics and accuracy and precision statistics. So out of that, it gets 63 points out of 90. The fourth section is functional description. It covers things like pin configuration, pin function, function tables, block diagrams, etc. This data sheet doesn't have a function table and a pin function like you would see in a modern data sheet. Instead, it has diagrams, and they work, but compared to how modern data sheets are written, it's antiquated. And because of that, it lost points. If this data sheet was updated and it was modernized, it wouldn't be written this way. And I'm not grading it based on how it was in 1977. I'm basing it on how it would be in 2023. And because of that, it lost some points there. And it's 45 points out of 75 points. The fifth section is application information. So does it give us good reference schematics? Does it show me the footprint and the layout? Does it show me the application notes? Are there good component selection guidelines listed? Things like that. It doesn't have very good application notes. It doesn't have very good power supply recommendations and component selection guidelines. But that's fine. Again, it's CMOS logic. It's fine. Doesn't necessarily need it, but it lost points because of that. It went for 40 out of 60. Section 6 is quality and reliability. This covers things like quality standards, reliability information, failure rate data, test and evaluation procedures, and it doesn't really have any of that. It has information about life cycle because of the ordering addendum. But other than that, it doesn't really have anything. And again, you'd argue, well, it doesn't need it. It's CMOS logic, and it lost points because of that. The seventh section is packaging and handling, and this includes everything down to how the IC is labeled, all the way up to how the reel is labeled and how the tape is spaced out. And it has packaging information where it talks about the tape and stuff, but it doesn't have handling precautions. It doesn't have storage life. It doesn't have labeling or marking, which is very important. And so it got 10 out of 30 points because of that. The eighth section is support and documentation. This is message boards. Is there additional documentation? Are there links to other things? It may not have all of the stuff in the data sheet, but there may be a link and additional documentation to some of the information I need. And it does that very, very well. Texas Instruments has a very detailed technical library that they have curated over half a century, and it's there for you to consume for free. So because of that, it got 46 out of 60 points. Section 9 is update and revision control. Is there a revision history? Is there an update frequency on the datasheet? And there is not. And so because of that, this datasheet gets 0 out of 30 points. And the 10th section is overall impression, clarity, completeness, relevance to the application. And this datasheet received 11 out of 15 points. Good job. All right, I hope you're ready. Here it comes. It's the final score for the CD4017B datasheet as found on the TI.com website, and it receives 325 out of 555. Join me next time when we'll go over the Diodes Incorporated PAM8301 filterless Class D mono audio amplifier. I can't wait. All music provided by Vexagon in Augusta, Georgia. Be sure to follow us on Twitter at Datasheet Digest and check us out on the World Wide Web at datasheetdigest.com. Thanks.